This is the fourth night of our Vacation Bible School, and we are honored to welcome you as we are studying our big God from the standpoint of his work with Elijah and Elisha. And tonight we invite your attention to 1 Kings chapter 19 as we explore the idea God is bigger than me alone. And I want you to underscore in your thinking that idea that God is bigger than me alone. And I'm just waiting to see if it's going to do it again. We have two gurus and a gremlin that we deal with in this building somewhere. God is bigger than me alone. Stick that idea of alone in your mind as we move through our study. You have an outline. If you did not get one, there's some here that you may get after our class. But we'll spend most of our time in the text, so regardless of what that does, you will not lose out. Tonight, in the first 8 verses, we talk about really what's involved in the theme of our study tonight: the depression of Elijah. You might want to Google the depression statistics of people in the world and find out that this is a problem that is faced by a number of people. You may have faced it yourself, or some family member may have dealt with the matter of depression. We're going to see how Elijah went through this and what God did to assist him, point out some principles that may be helpful if you're dealing with it, or if you're dealing with someone who is, that you might be able to help them. In verses 1 and 2, we have the source of the depression, and it consists of 2 things. First of all, Ahab's report to Jezebel about what had happened in chapter 18. Now, a lot of us, when we focus on chapter 18, often just focus on Mount Carmel and the fire coming down and Jehovah proving that he is God. But also remember that the false prophets were put to death. And in remembering that, remember the false prophets were on Jezebel's payroll. They were being supported by the government. And Jezebel was their main source of encouragement. So when Ahab comes home and tells his wife that Jehovah has proved that Baal is not God, and all the false prophets have been put to death, it brings us to the second part of the source of his depression, and that's Jezebel's response. So when you look at verses 1 and 2, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. So 2 things: all he had done in the matter of the offering, and then he had executed the prophets. Then Jezebel sent a Moloch, a messenger. Sometimes that messenger may be an angel, but here it's a human messenger, a deputy, someone sent with authority. And this messenger came to Elijah specifically, saying, "So let the gods do, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." Was this a defiant statement on the part of Jezebel against Jehovah? That even though he had enabled Elijah to perform the deeds of chapter 18, he would not be able to protect Elijah from Jezebel and her gods. Jezebel had the idea if you lose one god, you have a pantheon that will step in. But remember this, the god under consideration in chapter 18, or the gods, were the Baalim. But Jezebel also worshiped the gods of Sidon, the Sidonians. So she is seeing more than a defeat of her religious system. And she says to Elijah, you have one day to live. You have one day to live. You may have sat across the desk from a physician and heard that dreaded C word spoken to you. And I would almost guarantee first question in your mind or maybe out of your mouth was, how long do I have? How long do I have? I sat in the hospital room in LaGrange, Georgia, of my best friend. As the doctor came in and met with the family, I had asked, did he want me present at that time, or did he want it just be family? And he requested I stay. And the doctor spoke with them and said, you have 18 months. And I could not constrain. I spoke up and said, Don, that's their estimate, not God's. And he did live longer than their estimate. But Jezebel says, your God, Jehovah, is not going to be able to deliver you from my gods. You have one day to live. When I taught in our schools of preaching, I sometimes would ask our preacher students, how would you like to be that preacher? That some irate church member says to you, by this time tomorrow, I will have killed you. And if you think that's an impossibility, you need to put your shoes on and get in the water. In America, in the South, in the Bible Belt. So how would you like to be there? You have one day to live. And so we see the source of the depression. And then in verses 3 to 8, we move to look at the signs of the depression. If you're dealing with someone that's going through depression or you're going through it yourself, I would highly recommend that you do some research and identify what are generally laid out as the signs of depression so that you can recognize it. Sometimes what people call depression isn't. But depression has some telltale signs that you can recognize that will generally tell you this is that with which we're dealing. And we see some of them in our study tonight. Number one, flight. In verse 3, and when he saw, that's in italics, when he saw, he arose and ran for his life. Ran for his life. And he goes to Beersheba, 95 miles. He runs 95 miles away from the source of the depression and goes down into the tribe of Judah. If you're taking notes or you're writing on your notes I gave you, underscore these three words. When he saw. Actually, it was when he heard, but it's worded when he saw. And hold your finger here and turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and look at verse 7. Now, this is the chapter where Paul says, when we put off this earthly tent, if we're faithful Christians, we have a better home that's awaiting for us in heaven. And he discusses that. But then in verse 7 he says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. That's easier read than done. It takes conviction to walk by faith. It takes conversion to walk by faith. It's a lot easier to walk by sight. And Elijah, who has been walking by faith on Mount Carmel, is now walking or running by sight. It's interesting in 1 Kings 18:46, when Elijah had come to Jezreel, he was running ahead of Ahab. When he left Jezreel, he's running away from Jezebel. And if you want to do a real study so you can understand this, study the passages that deal with Jezebel. She was a handful. This is not just your run-of-the-mill aggravated woman. This is an aggravated heathen. And that's a lot worse. And so she is quite a formidable character with whom Elijah has been having to deal. But why did he flee, we ask? He had been a part of that victory on Mount Carmel. Do we see, and you'll have to answer this in your own study, do we see Elijah's faith weaken? It's easy to be a Christian when you're surrounded by folks who believe like you do, and whom you are reasonably assured are going to support what you're preaching and teaching. It's something else when you're the only one standing. If you've ever been the only one standing, you know what that's like. And now the only one standing, in his mind, has a day to live, according to Jezebel. And you and I need to understand, the Bible, in recording the lives of its heroes, records their weaknesses as well as their strengths in order to encourage us. You remember we read from James last night concerning Elijah that he was a man who had like passions, like feelings that we do. So our faith can get weak. We would not be out of place every day to pray, Lord, help me be strong in the faith today. Strengthen my faith so that I'll be able to withstand what is thrown against me and be able to stand. Now you read Ephesians 6:10 through 17. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand, but you are standing by withstanding the darts of the evil one. And so Elijah has those darts coming at him. Criticism, threats, the like, can discourage us. They can make us afraid, and they can cause us to be depressed. So you look at the source, the report of Ahab and the response of Jezebel. And now you see this number one sign of depression. run away from it all. I don't want to have to think about it. I don't want to have to deal with it. I want to get away from it. That's a normal flight response. When you're faced with a threat, you are going to do one of two things. You're going to fight or flee. And here Elijah flees. But don't be too harsh on Elijah until you walk in his shoes. Until you face that kind of criticism, those kinds of threats, and you've gone through it. Then you can tell someone how you got through it, and that might help them. I think we're hard sometimes on preachers who leave when we don't know the whole story. It's easy to play armchair quarterback. It won't be long before real sports will start again. And I tell our folks here, we have a banter back and forth about the real team and others. And I tell them it is so much fun to be an armchair coach. I know all the plays that ought to be called. I know why what they called wasn't the right play. I can sit in my chair and I can win that game strategically every time. It's something else to be the one on the sideline who has to make a split-second decision or who has things coming at you that other folks don't understand. So number one is flee. Get away from it. But then in verse 3, we also see he arose and ran for his life and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. Now notice this. And left his servant there. Second sign, withdrawal from people. A retreat from everyone. I want to be alone. I don't want to be around anybody. I don't want to have to deal with anyone. Just leave me alone. And so he leaves the servant in Beersheba. And he goes off by himself. And then in verse 4, he left his servant in Beersheba, but he himself, by himself, went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a, probably you have juniper tree there. If you're reading the New King James, it put broom tree in the text, but juniper in the margin. And sign of depression number 3, cessation from activity. Quit doing anything. I don't want to do anything. Just leave me alone. Don't ask me to do anything. Don't ask me if I want anything. Just leave me alone. I want to be by myself, and I'm not going to participate in anything. I'm quitting life. And I'm going to stay right here under this juniper tree right by myself. Discouragement can do that to you also. When you've put your heart into something and you know it's not appreciated, it can discourage you to the point that you want to just sit down and not do anything else. And you go through that process in your mind where you're saying, what's the use? Now that's not depression, that's discouragement. And remember, Elijah is facing that. But here, he's just saying, I don't want to be involved in anything. I want to sit right here on this juniper tree. And then also in verse 4, and he prayed that he might die, and said, it is enough. Now, Jehovah, take my life. I know better than my fathers. I am no better than my father. Sign of depression number 4, desire to die. I want to just die. And the desire to die is not prompted by, I'm ready to go to heaven, I'm ready to get out of this world. It's, I'm so depressed that I can't fathom going on living. I can't imagine how I can go on living in and of myself. He is discouraged. He's afraid. And this is his cry for help. Now, when you Google your depression statistics, read the connection between depression and suicide. And a lot of us are not equipped to deal with suicide. If someone tells you, I'm thinking about killing myself, you better take that seriously and get them help right then, professional help. Don't leave them. Never leave someone who says that by himself. But then you want to move to ask, do you have a plan? Probably most discouraged people at one point or another has said, I'd just be better off dead. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about seeing death as an escape from the depression. And so he's crying for help. And many people cry for help. Teenagers, because of peer pressure, and now this bullying online stuff that's going around. Some teenagers have taken their lives because they've been humiliated on social media. It's serious business. And I just want to die. But you need to know that he's not by himself. Turn to the book of Job, in Job chapter 3. Now, if you want to think you're bad off, and you think you're bad off, you really want to be made to feel better, read the book of Job. And you'll say, I don't have any problems. But in Job chapter 3, Job asked 3 questions. In verses 1 to 10, he asked, why did I not die before I was born? Why didn't I die in the womb? Beginning in verse 11 through verse 19, he asked, why did I not die when I was born? Why couldn't I have been stillborn? And then beginning in verse 19, verse 20 rather, going through verse 26, he asked, why can I not die now? And you go back and read his condition, and then you think about 3 friends who sit down and look at him for a week and don't say a word. And then when they start talking, it's worse off than when they weren't talking, because they blame him for all of it, and they're wrong. But Job faced this idea. If you look at the 11th chapter of the book of Numbers, Moses is so discouraged with these people. He says, I'm not able to bear all this. And in verse 15, if you treat me like this, please kill me here and now. If I have to keep on bearing this by myself, I'd rather be dead. That's discouragement, not depression. Job may have been dealing with depression. Moses is just at the bottom of his rope in dealing with these people. I tell you, I admire Moses. He was the meekest man in the earth, the Bible says, and you see why in 40 years of dealing with folks who didn't know how to do anything but grumble. I've often said it's a good thing it wasn't me, because when Moses struck the rock, that's not what I would have struck after dealing with all these people. Moses is discouraged. Jeremiah dealt with this. Jeremiah chapter 20, and I'll let you do the reading. But Jeremiah said on one occasion, I'm through with this preaching business. I'm going to open up a hotel on the side of the road. I'm through. I'm going to have an inn for wayfaring men, a motel. And one place I preached, I had a fellow who owned 2 motels, and he said if he ever opened it up, he would go back to preaching. But he's down. I'm getting out of this. And then Jonah faced that, but Jonah's problem was he was angry. God was saving folks he wanted destroyed, and it made him angry. So he said, just kill me. But Job, of all of these, probably comes nearer to Elijah in what he's battling than anyone else. And so he prays to die. But do you notice we see here what you might call an unprayed prayer? He doesn't pray to live. He doesn't pray to live. Has no desire to live. I want to die. In verse 4, I'm no better than my fathers. Sign of depression number 5, dejection. He felt sorry for himself. He's selfish. One fellow suggests he might even be arrogant in this. But I'm no better off than they are. There's nothing special about me. I'm just dejected, and there's no reason for me to go on. Then verse 5, then as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, and you have sign of depression number 6, sleep. Depressed people want to sleep because if they're asleep, they don't have to face reality. As long as I can stay asleep, everything's okay. I don't have to think about it, I don't have to deal with it. And so they want to sleep all the time. Now there are other signs, but you see these 6 signs in Elijah. Now one of them would be serious, but all of them shows he is in a very dark place right now. And so Jehovah begins to solve it. Verses 5 to 8. Now, if you're a Christian, you're facing some of this, your number one solution, number one above everything else, is God. God has to be our number one solution. Everything else is inferior. Even if it treats the mental health aspect of it, it doesn't treat the soul. It doesn't treat the spiritual aspect of it. So where could I go but to the Lord? Take it to God in prayer. And so in verse 5 and verse 6, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. Then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Solution number 1, arise and eat. He was hungry, but he didn't think he was hungry. He had lost his appetite. But he really was hungry. The angel provided a cake baked for him and said, you need to get up. Notice that. He's wanting to sleep. Get up and eat. Get up and eat. If you grew up in the South with a mama like mine, that was the solution to most every problem. Get up and eat. That's why I'm a danger around food. I was reared that way. It's not my fault, it's Mama's fault. I'm not to blame. I have no individual responsibility in that. But the angel said, now look, the first thing you have to do is become active again and feed your body. You have to get your body going. I lived at a place one time that we had a lady, she wasn't a member of the church, but she was a lady in the community. And she'd been watching PTL, if any of you remember what that was, this network of preaching. And every time they were telling folks, send in your money, and you'll have riches. Send in your money and God will bless you. And she was on Social Security check, and she was sending most all of that to them and not buying groceries. And I was on radio every day, and she was listening, and she called the building and asked would I come see her, and I did. And she told me what was going on. And I said, the number one thing I'd tell you to do is don't send them another cent, and let's go get you something to eat. She was losing weight, sending all that money, not eating herself, waiting on those blessings that they promised that they couldn't deliver. So get up and eat. And then in verse 6, then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Solution number 2, rest. There's a difference in sleeping to escape and sleeping to rest. I have slept and not rested. Have you ever been there? There's a difference in sleeping to escape and in sleeping to rest. So you eat, you drink, and now because you're so tired, and you're tired because mentally you've worn yourself out. Honestly, you can do a hard day's work physically and not wear yourself out like you can wear yourself out mentally. And that's where Elijah was. He'd have been better off doing a hard day's physical labor. So you lie down and rest. Verse 7, and the angel of Jehovah came back the second time. Notice he didn't just let him keep sleeping. And touched him and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, the mountain of God, the mountain of Elohim. So, solution number 3, prepare for the journey ahead. Don't escape the journey ahead. Get ready for it. Prepare for it. It's interesting that Elijah went to Mount Horeb. We know it more readily as Sinai. But the mountain of God. Go back to Exodus 3 for that connotation. And then solution number 4 is something you and I need to remember, and it's easy to forget. We need to remember that Elijah was loved by Jehovah even when Elijah wasn't at his best. One person said, the best of men are men at their best. So we're all just clay-footed people. Brother Turner used to say to the preacher students, men, we all have clay feet, which meant we all face the difficulties of life and we can be hurt by them. Don't think you're invincible, that nothing can hurt you. So Elijah needed to remember, Jehovah loves me even in this state, even when I'm suffering, even when I'm depressed, even when I can't function for Him at my best. He loves me. It is not a children's song. Jesus loves me, this I know, because the Bible tells me so. There's not a one of us in this assembly or on social media tonight who doesn't need that message. When I'm not at my best, God still loves me. Spiritually, no man was at his best, was he? When God sent his only begotten Son to die. Romans 5, 8, and 9 says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. The love of God. And Elijah needed to remember that. So the first 8 verses, we deal with Elijah's depression. In verses 9 through 14, we deal with Elijah's dedication. In verse 9, Elijah takes an intermission in all this. And the text says, then he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of Jehovah came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? So the word of Jehovah made an inquiry. Was this question intended to get Elijah to realize you didn't need to run away from Jezebel? Or was the question intended to say to Elijah, Elijah, instead of doing Jehovah's work, you're doing nothing? I don't know. We'll have to get to heaven to ask. But I do know the questions are designed to bring Elijah to a realization that he needed. And Elijah's integrity is on the line. So in verse 10, he said, go out and stand, or Elijah said in verse 10, so he said, I have been very zealous for Jehovah, the God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left. Now he says the same thing in verse 14. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Now he says, I've been faithful in the face of all this idolatry. These people have slain Jehovah's prophets. Nabi is the word there, one of the 3 words used to identify a prophet in the Old Testament. But now Elijah lets us into his mindset, and he tells us how he's thinking. He is thinking, since Jezebel has sought to kill all these prophets, I'm the only one left. Now you remember, if you've been with us all week, remember what he's forgetting right here? Obadiah had hid 100 of them in a cave. But he forgot that. But the complex is, I'm by myself. That's the reason for our theme tonight. Our God is bigger than me alone. He had stopped looking at Jehovah. He'd started looking at the scoreboard, and to him the scoreboard said 1. If you are a Christian, ignore the scoreboard. It is not a gauge of the strength of a congregation. And the scoreboard, how many are with you, is not a gauge of the strength of the man. But Elijah's scoreboard right now said 1. And they're trying to kill me. Now, he may have been thinking, if she succeeds in killing me, God won't have a spokesman at all. So he's putting more importance on himself than he ought. But that's normal when you're discouraged. Have you ever said, don't answer out loud, have you ever said something like, I'm the only one trying to do right? I'm the only one in this house that wants to do things right. Maybe you've said that about a congregation. We get the feeling that way sometimes. And so in verses 11 to 12, you have the immensity of Jehovah. He said, go out and stand on the mountain before Jehovah. And behold, Jehovah passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks to pieces before Jehovah. Circle it. But Jehovah was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. Circle it, even though it's in italics. But Jehovah was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. Circle it. But Jehovah was not in the fire. Now those are three great eye-catching things. Powerful things. Verse 12, and after the fire, a still, small voice. And go back to verse 11. Jehovah passed by, a great and strong wind. A still, small voice. You have a contrast. Here you've had all these great things, and then there's a still small voice, something small in comparison. Don't have time to preach it, but you go study it. Jehovah uses small things. So verse 13, so it was when Elijah heard that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? In verse 14, he repeated what he'd already said. I'm here because they're killing all your prophets, and I'm the only one alone that's left. So in verse 15, you have Elijah's deputation. God puts Elijah to work. So Elijah is to return to the wilderness of Damascus, and he is to anoint several people. When people are discouraged, put them back to work. Help them get back in the game. Help them become important again. Let them see they are needed. Don't baby people. Give them work to do. Help them be encouraged by what they can do. Sometimes we get down on ourselves and we think, well, I can't do anything. I can't preach. I can't lead singing. I can't do anything. Can you invite somebody to the services? Can you write a card of encouragement? The national symbol in America today is this right here. And the national posture in America is either this right here or this right here. Could you do any of that to encourage somebody that's depressed, discouraged? Invite someone to attend the services? Can you hand out a tract? Can you put one of our business cards on the table? Oh, there's so much you can do. Can you open up the church house so folks can get in? Can you lock up the church house so thieves can't get in? So much you can do. One place I lived, right across the street, our parking lot ended here. There was a street and there was a house. And in that house lived an older couple who were members of the congregation. And they, every Sunday morning, and I always get to the building about 30 minutes early, every Sunday morning they were sitting in the parking lot when I got there. Now they just live right across the street. And the reason they're sitting in the parking lot is they can't get in the building. It's locked. And back then I was invited to elders meetings, and every Monday night we had a marathon elders meeting. And during one of those marathons, I said to the elders, why don't we ask this couple, would they unlock the building when they get here? They beat me here. Why don't we give them a key and ask them, will they unlock the building? Well, it just so happened that the brother-in-law of the woman was one of our elders, so he was in that marathon meeting. And when I asked the question, he spoke up and said, they won't do it. Now you have to understand, I was a younger preacher than I am now. And so I said, how do you know they won't? Have you asked them? No, but they won't do it. Well, I said, how do you know they won't if you haven't asked them? Well, I just know they won't do it. I said, are you going to fire me if I ask them? He said, no, but they won't do it. So Wednesday night, there they are sitting in the parking lot. I go in, they come in the building, and I turn around and ask this simple question. If we gave you a key, would you be willing when you get here to go around and unlock the doors of the building? They said, we'd be happy to. I couldn't wait for that man to get the services. They said they'd be happy to. And he had another sister-in-law that wouldn't do something we wish she would do. He said, if you get her to do it, I'll buy you a steak. Well, I never did get the steak. But I was so thankful. They spent the rest of their time as members there unlocking the building. That's something they could do. They felt important doing that. That's what Elijah needed. Go back to work. If you're depressed, get to work. Find your niche. Find something you can do. Feel good about what you can do. So you go and you anoint Hazael to be the king of Syria. You anoint Jehu to be the king of Israel. You anoint Elisha, now look at that one, the son of Shaphat, of Abel Mahola, to be Nabi in your place. And Elijah is the only prophet of whom we have a record that ever anointed his successor. And so here you're introduced to Elisha that's going to carry on. Now, Elijah did not anoint Hazael and Jehu, and we don't know why. Some think it may be that Ahab repented and God did not immediately remove him. I don't know. We'll have to ask. But we do know Elisha would anoint them. He finished the task of doing that. And then in verses 17 and 18, Elijah is told there are going to be problems in the future. A lot of people are going to die. But Elisha will slay people. But he will slay them with the word of Jehovah. Hosea 6, verse 5. But he says in verse 18, yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. I want to get to a slide that I think is in here because I want to emphasize 7,000. Elijah's scoreboard said 1. Jehovah's scoreboard said 7,000 plus. Get out of the scoreboard business. You do your work. You do God's work. And he said, here are 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal. They've not kissed Baal. You're not by yourself. So in verses 19 to 21, you have Elijah's delegation. In verse 19, Elijah comes from Horeb. He finds Elisha plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. 11 are standing before Elisha. He's holding the 12th. This may indicate he was a prosperous man, but Elijah took his mantle and threw it on Elisha. And here you have the call of Elisha as a prophet. Now, if you come back tomorrow night, we're going to look at an incident in the life of Elisha. But right here, he is called to be a prophet. And Elisha makes a decision. In verses 20 and 21, he cuts ties with his past. He cuts ties with his parents. Not that he forgets them, but they are not the ones whom he will serve first in his life. In fact, he kissed them, which is what many do when they're leaving, but he cut ties with his profession. He quit farming and started preaching. And in verse 21, we see Elisha's commitment. So Elisha turned back from him and took a yoke of oxen and slaughtered them and boiled their flesh, using the oxen's equipment, and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and followed Elijah and became his servant. Does not that sound a whole lot like, "Come follow me and I will make you fishers of men"? You've been a fisher of fish. I'll make you a fisher of men. Come follow me. Isn't that what Jesus said? He walked by where Levi was collecting taxes, and he said, "Get up, Levi. Quit being a tax collector and be a soul collector. Come follow me." And so Elisha makes this commitment. Now, if you turn to 2 Kings chapter 2, first, you read about Elisha taking on the role of Nabi when Elijah ascends to heaven in that fiery chariot. And how important it is, and you would do well to study the life of Elisha and see the dedication of Elisha to God. But it's interesting here, this manifestation from Jehovah comes, and Elijah doesn't die a physical death. Now his body's changed from mortal to immortal. 1 Corinthians 15 shows that by implication. But he is taken to God. He's done his work. Notice God brought him out of depression to take him home with him. Put him back to work. If you're battling depression tonight, get help. Recognize the signs. Let us help you if we can. But go to God above everything else, because our God is bigger than me alone.